12th of March 1963, Vienna, Austria, 16 p.m. 2,000 guests have already gathered at the Vienna State Opera in feverish expectations of today's event, Richard Wagner's Valkyrie. Backstage, there's a lot of chaos. I mean, everybody, the performers, the musicians, they're getting ready, they're getting hyped up, and everybody's kind of running back and forth, like it's wild back there. And that's why no one noticed that a young, strange man was lurking around backstage, a man who was not part of the staff, and who was actually not allowed to be there at all. Now, the opera was actually not his intended destination. For the past hour, he had been wandering the streets after having a huge fight with his mother. And he was like, I'm gonna let somebody else suffer for it. And that is when he turned around and spotted the opera. He walked in, determined to take somebody's life that very night. This is the True Crime Cocktail Hour, and this is the story of the infamous murder in the opera. Quick side note, just before we get started, today's case is quite old, but did you know that as we speak, investigators in Vienna got their hands full as well? Because, ladies and gentlemen, there is a serial killer on the loose in Vienna right fucking now. Okay, somebody is out there stabbing and killing homeless people in their sleep. There have been 4 attacks within the last 3 months. 3 people died and 1 person survived. And the last attack was like 2 or 3 weeks ago. And this man, he was not killed, he was also beheaded. Wild times in Vienna. Okay, but now back to the opera. So you see, Richard Wagner's Valkyrie was not the only thing that was going on at the Vienna State Opera that very night. A group of little girls also had their ballet practice on the 4th floor. And one of these little girls was 11-year-old Dagmar Fuhrich. Now, she was already dressed up, she was getting ready, she was warming up in the corridor of the 4th floor when a strange young man approached her. And he told her that he was a doctor and that he was there to make sure all the girls were physically fit for their ballet practice. So he asked her to follow him into the bathroom of the 4th floor. And unfortunately, Dagmar believed him and she followed him to the bathroom. Just 10 minutes later, a hairdresser who worked at the opera, she walked into the bathroom to find a blood bath. She found the dead body of 11-year-old Dagmar Fuhrich lying on the floor. She had been stabbed 37 times. So look, the director of the opera was the only one who was informed about the murder, because as the murder took place, the music, the concert, it was already going. Now, to avoid mass hysteria, everything that happened was kept secret. And what the director wanted to do is he wanted to lock up all entrances and exits of the opera just in case the murderer was still in the building. But when they found little drops of blood leading to the door of the back exit, they figured that it was already too late. The murderer was already gone. Listen, the autopsy report said that there were no signs of rape or sexual assault, right? She wasn't found undressed or anything. But still, according to the investigators, they were dealing with a lust murder, probably because it was such a random attack with so many knife stabs. We don't know, but anyhow, the media also reported about this murder as a sexual motivated murder. Now, there were witnesses coming forward who all said they saw the man who murdered this little girl. They saw a man fleeing the crime scene in a hurry, and they all gave descriptions of this man. But you know how it is with witness descriptions, you know? Every description, girl, was different than the next one. They all varied so much, okay? Someone said this man had scars on his face. And then the next person said, no, he didn't have scars on his face, but he was wearing a blood-soaked coat. And then the next person said, no, he wasn't wearing a coat, but he was wearing a leather bag. And then the next one was like, no, I didn't see a leather bag. So that was quite unhelpful. A taxi driver also testified that he saw a young man coming running out of the opera, and he remembered that so vividly because this man, he just ran over the streets without looking left and right, and this taxi driver almost ran him over. So the investigation immediately began, and I gotta hand it to them, they really spared no effort. They questioned 14,000 people, everybody from Dagmar's classmates to the staff of the opera. They were also looking into the whereabouts of registered sex offenders, and one of the investigators, he attended Dagmar's funeral in hopes that the killer would show up to relive his crime. But nothing. The media reported about it nonstop. Everyone knew about it. It was the topic number one. But they had no forensic evidence. The witness reports were all very different. They had nothing to show for. And for 3 months, nothing happened in this case. That is, until 3 months later, a newspaper received a letter written by a man who claimed to be the opera murderer and the murderer of Dagmar Fuhrich. Now, investigators were never fully able to determine whether this letter was written by the killer himself or just by a copycat. But the sending of this letter was also, strangely enough, the beginning of a series of random attacks on seemingly random women on the streets in broad daylight, okay? So one woman, she was attacked in church. Same happened to a woman, she was walking down the street in broad daylight. And then another woman, she was attacked in the park while sitting on a park bench. So this woman, she was sitting on a park bench. She was minding her own business when somebody came from behind and stabbed her in the neck. Now another woman saw this attack and she started screaming, and that caused the attacker to stop his movement when he was just about to hit for the second time. All women survived, but the attacker was always able to get away. But then on the 6th of August 1963, another woman was attacked, and her name was Emma. So she came home from work and she was about to open the door to her apartment complex. She walked into the corridor, and that's when somebody came from behind and stabbed her in the neck with a fucking fork. Now in addition, this time the attacker also tried to steal her purse. And I'm not really sure whether Emma actually noticed that she was stabbed in the neck with a fucking fork. I guess there was some kind of adrenaline rush. Anyway, she fought him, and she was able to fight him off, get away from him, and run out on the streets. Luckily for her, there was a street police officer standing on the other side of the road. So Emma ran up to this police officer and she told him what happened, that she was attacked by this strange man and that the strange man fled into the adjacent building. Now this street police officer, his name was Johann Kovarik, and he didn't waste any time and he ran into this building, which is quite remarkable because first of all, he was completely alone. And second of all, he was quite young. He was 21 years old. But he didn't feel fear, obviously. He just ran straight into the building. And as a matter of fact, he came across a strange-looking man on the second floor. Now, this police officer, he approached this man and he asked him what he was doing here. To which this man replied, "Oh, I was just about to knock on somebody's door to ask them if I could use their bathroom." So then this police officer, he asked this young man, "Look, there was an attack just in the adjacent building. Did you hear any screams? Did you notice anything?" And this man, he was a bad liar. He was like, "Oh my God, no, but that's horrible." But it wasn't really convincing. And this police officer, he was like, "Yeah, right, no, I don't believe a word you say, pal. You're coming with me." Now the police officer and this young man, they came out of the building, and then the police officer asked Emma, "Hey, is this the man who attacked you?" But she couldn't say for sure because the man who attacked her, he actually was wearing a sweater, and this man was not wearing a sweater. Now, as a matter of fact, a bloody sweater was found on the second floor of the adjacent building. And all the other women who were attacked, they were brought in to look at this man who was just arrested for attacking Emma, and they were asked if this is the man who attacked them, and all women identified this man as their attacker. This young man's name was Joseph Weinwurm. He was 33 years old and he was just released from a penitentiary for the mentally ill and psychological conspicuous. That's always good. So Joseph was arrested, but he refused to talk to anybody, to answer the investigator's question. He just sat there in silence the whole time. Now, mind you, he was arrested for these attacks on these women, not for the murder of Dagmar Fuhrich. But investigators felt like, you know what, we're pretty sure he's involved in that too. Now, as I said, they had no forensic evidence. No witness was actually able to identify him. All the witness reports were kind of different, so the only chance they had at this point is get a confession out of him. But you know, back then, the number one method to get a confession out of somebody is to literally beat it out of them. But the leading investigator in this case, his name was Franz Blasko, and he wanted to try a different approach. Now, the method that he wanted to test is widely used today, but back then, he was harshly criticized for it. So Franz Blasko, he was allowed to visit Joseph in prison once a day. And what he did is he just sat down with him and he started talking to him about random things. He tried to become his friend, gain his trust, build a friendship or whatever, build some kind of connection. And his method eventually worked. And Joseph Weinwurm gave a full confession. But the number one question was still not answered. Why, Joseph? Why? But Joseph had a very casual answer, and he delivered it in a very casual way. So basically, he just sat back and he was like, oh, it's actually nothing. It's just, I just hate women. Tale old as time, huh? So Joseph said that he already experienced hatred towards women as a toddler because the teachers in kindergarten were always so mean to him. And then his mother, which would not show any love or affection, but degrade and insult him on a regular basis, which, fair enough, his mother, she really was a handful. Because she also spoke in court, and whatever she was saying was actually quite unhelpful to the case, because all she did was again degrade and insult her son in front of everybody. And she was like, oh, my son is a pathetic loser and a homosexual. So much for that. So according to Joseph, his hatred, the way women treated him, that's what led him to a life of crime. And the murder of Dagmar Fuhrich was obviously not his first crime. So when Joseph was 17, he forced a young girl to undress in front of him at gunpoint. Now, he was caught, and he was also found guilty for this crime, but he never got a penalty for it. So they were kind of like, guilty, and now go back home to your mother, you sick freak. And then 2 years later, Joseph tried to cause harm to a woman with a pair of scissors. Now, this time he was also found guilty. He was caught and found guilty, but he also got a penalty, and they also did a psychological evaluation of him, and the result was insane. But this report of his mental state, it just shows how little they knew about mental health and how to treat it, because the report said that his character was sick, but not his brain. Anyway, Joseph was sent to a sanatorium, where he was released after 1 year as, quote, healed and insightful. Although one thing I have to really mention here is this sanatorium, right? It had a bad reputation, and I don't know if it still exists today, but let me tell you, honey, if it does, it's probably haunted or something, So from 1953 to 1963, Joseph spent the majority of his time in prison for minor offenses like burglary or theft. And all these prison sentences, they would not keep him from committing crimes again and again. And so eventually he was sent to the penitentiary, where he was released 1 week before Dagmar's murder. And then the 12th of March arrived, and I couldn't figure out what he was fighting about with his mother. But anyway, he was so filled with rage. It was like the last drop for him, and so he decided to take it out on somebody else. And unfortunately, his decision fell on 11-year-old Dagmar Fuhrich, who, by the way, is 11 years old. She ain't no woman. So Joseph Weinwurm was finally removed from the streets, and he was sentenced to life in prison. Fun fact, back then, in the Austrian law, you were obligated to spend the anniversaries of your crime in a dark chamber with a little water and bread. So in Joseph's case, every year on the 12th of March, he would sit in the dark chamber the entire day with just water and bread. No light, no window, no fresh air, nothing. They got rid of that law in the 80s. So Joseph spent the rest of his life in prison until his death in 2004. From his 74 years of life, he spent 51 in prison. Now, according to the prison guards, he was a loner, he didn't have any friends, he barely spoke to anyone. He just spent the majority of his time luring in birds with cake and crumbles of bread, which is why he was given the nickname Birdman, just like Robert Stroud at Alcatraz. So that was the story of the opera murder. Thank you so much for hanging out with me, and if you want, I will see you again next Friday for another cocktail and another interesting true crime case.